I will never forget that rain-slicked night on our doorstep in Colorado Springs. My suitcase sat on the wet stone as my father threw the disownment papers signed and notarized at my feet. He looked at me with cold fury and delivered the line that defined the next 16 years. A Whitaker daughter does not become a soldier. At 18, I had just secured an Army ROTC scholarship. He demanded I choose my family's defense logistics empire or my country. I chose. He signed the affidavit right there. I left that house and never returned. 16 years passed. Last week, the Colorado Rescue Center picked up an ELT signal from a private jet crashed high in the Rockies. The passenger, Harold Whitaker, the man who erased me. And this time, his survival lay entirely in my hands on a mission I commanded from the cockpit of a Black Hawk. In the shadow of Pikes Peak, the Whitaker name was more than just a family lineage. It was a brand of ironclad reliability and aristocratic precision. Growing up in our sprawling estate in Colorado Springs, life felt less like a childhood and more like a permanent rehearsal for a gala that never ended. My father, Harold Whitaker, was the architect of this curated reality. As the founder of Whitaker Defense Logistics, he didn't just sell parts for fighter jets and armored vehicles. He sold the illusion of absolute stability. He had a mantra that echoed through the marble hallways of our home, a rule that governed every meal, every conversation, and every breath we took. Image builds empires. To the outside world, we were the gold standard of the American dream. My brother Lucas was the golden boy, the heir apparent. From the time he could walk, he was groomed to take the helm of the family business. He was sent to the right prep schools, mentored by the right senators, and taught the art of the corporate handshake. While Lucas was being forged into a CEO, I was being sculpted into a centerpiece. My father's vision for me was clear. I was to be the refined Whitaker woman. I was enrolled in elite finishing programs, taught to speak 3 languages fluently, not for diplomacy, but for social grace, and instructed on how to navigate a ballroom without ever raising my voice or my pulse. Every decision in that house revolved around the reputation of the company. If we traveled, it was to locations that signaled wealth and restraint. If we spoke to the press, it was scripted to the last syllable. We were a defense family, but ironically, we lived in a fortress of glass where any crack in the image was considered a catastrophic failure. My father viewed our lives as assets on a balance sheet. Lucas was the growth potential. I was the aesthetic equity. The first real crack in that glass appeared during my junior year of high school. While my peers were looking at Ivy League brochures for liberal arts degrees, I was secretly obsessed with the mechanics of flight and the discipline of service. I didn't want to wear silk dresses to board meetings. I wanted to wear a flight suit and command a cockpit. The day I finally gathered the courage to tell my father I wanted to apply to West Point, the reaction wasn't the explosion of anger I expected. It was worse. He laughed. It was a dry, condescending sound that made my blood run cold. He didn't even look up from his financial reports as he dismissed my entire soul with a wave of his hand. "Sierra, don't be absurd," he said, his voice dripping with paternal mockery. "The military is a meat grinder. It's a place where women go to have their futures destroyed, their grace stripped away, and their potential wasted in the dirt. A Whitaker belongs in the sky, perhaps, but only in the cabin of a private Gulf Stream, not crawling through the mud." To him, the army wasn't a noble calling. It was a low-class distraction that would tarnish the Whitaker brand. He saw the military as a tool for his business, a customer to be managed, but never a life to be lived, especially not by his daughter. He truly believed that by stepping into a uniform, I would be committing social suicide and dragging his empire down with me. He didn't see a leader when he looked at me. He saw a rebellious asset that needed to be liquidated before it could cause a PR nightmare. Little did he know the very discipline he tried to suppress was exactly what would eventually lead me back to him in his darkest hour. Amidst the suffocating luxury of the Whitaker estate, my ambition felt like a flickering candle in a vacuum until I met Captain Rachel Ortega. She was an Army ROTC recruiting officer, a woman whose uniform was pressed with a sharpness that matched her intellect. While my father saw the military as a meat grinder for women, Captain Ortega stood as living proof of the contrary. She didn't look destroyed. She looked like a woman who owned every square inch of the ground she stood on. During a clandestine meeting at a local coffee shop far from the social circles my father patrolled, I poured out my frustrations. I told her about the expectations, the Whitaker image, and the impossibility of getting my father's blessing. She didn't offer me pity. Instead, she leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto mine with a piercing soldierly clarity. "Sierra," she said, her voice low but unshakable. "If you want to serve, don't ask permission." Those 7 words hit me harder than any lecture my father had ever given. They were a permission slip to stop seeking approval from a man who would never give it. Captain Ortega became my silent navigator. Under her guidance, I began the grueling process of applying for an Army ROTC scholarship. It was a life of double-agent precision. By day, I was the dutiful daughter attending debutante rehearsals. By night, I was studying military history training in the shadows of our estate's gym and filling out endless mountains of federal paperwork. Every time I felt the weight of my father's control, I whispered Ortega's mantra to myself. I wasn't just applying for a scholarship. I was plotting a prison break. The morning the thick official envelope arrived in the mail, my heart nearly stopped. I intercepted it before the house staff could place it on my father's desk. I retreated to my room, my fingers trembling as I tore the seal. Accepted. Not just accepted, I had been awarded a full 4-year scholarship. The United States Army saw something in me that my own blood refused to acknowledge: leadership, grit, and potential. In that moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, I fell into a trap of youthful naivety. I looked at the gold-embossed letter and thought, this changes everything. I convinced myself that once my father saw the prestige of the scholarship, once he saw that I wasn't just playing soldier, but had earned a merit-based commission, the Whitaker pride would kick in. Surely he would see the image of an Army officer daughter as an asset, not a liability. I decided then that I wouldn't hide it anymore. I would present my achievement at the one place where the Whitaker hierarchy was most absolute: the family dinner table. I walked downstairs that evening with the envelope tucked under my arm, fueled by a dangerous spark of hope that my father's love might finally outweigh his empire. The dining room of the Whitaker estate was a masterpiece of cold mahogany and silent high-backed chairs. That evening, the air felt unusually heavy, thick with the scent of expensive wine and the unspoken rules of our household. I sat across from my brother Lucas while my father occupied the head of the table like a king presiding over a court. The silver clinked against fine china, the only sound in a house where silence was a form of discipline. I waited for the main course to be cleared before I pulled the acceptance letter from my lap. My hands were steady, fueled by the naive belief that merit could bridge the gap between us. I laid the paper on the table and spoke the words I had practiced for weeks. I was joining the Army ROTC. I had earned a full scholarship. I was going to be an officer. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. My father didn't look at the paper. He didn't congratulate me on the achievement or ask about the program. He simply set his glass down, the crystal ringing sharply against the wood, and stood up. He didn't yell. Harold Whitaker never needed to yell to be terrifying. He looked at me with a cold, clinical detachment, as if I were a faulty component in one of his defense contracts. "A female officer?" He said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Do you have any idea what that looks like for Whitaker Defense Logistics? We sell the machinery of war to the Pentagon, Sierra. We provide the steel and the logic. We do not provide the daughters. To have a Whitaker woman in a uniform taking orders from men I play golf with, it makes us look desperate. It makes me look like I cannot even govern my own household." He walked toward the sideboard, his movements slow and deliberate. "You think this is about service? It's about vanity. You are choosing a hobby that will embarrass this family's brand. I have spent 30 years building an image of prestige, and I will not have it tarnished by a girl playing soldier." Then came the ultimatum delivered with the mechanical precision of a death sentence. He turned back to face me, his eyes devoid of any fatherly warmth. "You walk away from the army, or you walk away from this family." I looked at Lucas, pleading for a spark of sibling solidarity, but my brother kept his head down, staring intensely at his dessert fork. He was the heir, and he knew that standing up for me meant risking his own kingdom. He chose the empire over his sister without saying a single word. "I won't walk away, Dad," I said, my voice cracking but holding firm. "I earn this." My father didn't flinch. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a document that had clearly been prepared long before I sat down for dinner. It was a disownment affidavit, a legal severing of ties. He had anticipated my defiance and prepared the paperwork to erase me. He signed it right there, the pen scratching harshly against the paper in the quiet room. "Then you are no longer a Whittaker," he said, sliding the paper toward me. "Leave, now." I walked out of that dining room through the grand foyer and into the rain. Not a single person, not the staff, not my brother, and certainly not my father, uttered a word of goodbye. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, the sound of a vault locking me out of the only life I had ever known. I stood on the wet pavement, 18 years old, and completely alone, with nothing but a suitcase and a scholarship that was now my only lifeline. The first few years in the army weren't just a career path. They were a brutal, necessary strip mining of the refined woman my father had tried to build. Without the Whittaker safety net, the military became my entire world. It was a cold, hard survival. There were no silk sheets or catered meals, only the grit of the barracks, the weight of a ruck, and the relentless pressure of flight school at Fort Rucker. I wasn't just fighting to be a pilot. I was fighting to prove that the man who discarded me was wrong about everything I was. I chose the hardest path I could find, medevac. If my father's business was built on the machinery of war, I wanted my life to be built on the salvation within it. I became an Army aviation pilot, trading evening gowns for a Nomex flight suit and the stench of hydraulic fluid. My first deployment to Afghanistan was the ultimate crucible. In the thin air of the Hindu Kush image meant absolutely nothing. The mountains didn't care about your family's defense contracts or your social standing in Colorado Springs. The only thing that mattered was your ability to hold a hover while the world exploded around you. I flew a UH-60 Black Hawk into the dust-off missions that most pilots feared. We were the ones who flew into the red zones when everyone else was hunkering down, guided only by the desperate smoke of a flare and the frantic voice of a medic on the radio. Twice my bird took heavy fire from the ground. I can still hear the rhythmic, terrifying thwack, thwack, thwack of heavy-caliber rounds punching through the aluminum skin of my cockpit. The first time, a round severed a hydraulic line and the controls turned to lead in my hands. The second time, a piece of shrapnel embedded itself in the seat inches from my spine. In those moments, I didn't think about my father's disownment or the inheritance I had lost. I thought about the bleeding soldier in the back and the crew chief who was screaming clear over the intercom. War took its toll. I lost friends, real friends, whose names I still whisper when I can't sleep. I watched young men and women barely older than I was when I left home take their last breaths on the floor of my helicopter. But in that carnage, I discovered a profound truth that my father, in all his corporate wisdom, would never grasp: the sacred value of trust. In the Whittaker Empire, trust was a transaction, a chess move used to gain leverage. In the Army, trust was the oxygen we breathed. It was the unshakable bond between a pilot and her co-pilot, the unspoken promise that we would never leave a fallen comrade behind, regardless of the cost. My father built an empire on image. I built a life on integrity. 16 years have bled into one another. The 18-year-old girl standing in the rain is a ghost now. In her place stands Major Sierra Whitaker, a mission aircraft commander for the Colorado Army National Guard. I am a master of the high-altitude rescue, a veteran of 2 combat tours, and a leader of men and women who would die for me and I for them. My name is still Whitaker, but I've reclaimed it. It no longer belongs to a defense logistics firm. It belongs to the call sign of the Black Hawk that brings the dying back to life. I thought I had moved on. I thought the Rocky Mountains were just my training ground, not a bridge back to a past I had buried. But the mountains have a way of forcing a reckoning. The winter sun had not yet crested the jagged peaks of the Rockies when the alarm shattered the stillness of the ready room at Buckley Space Force Base. It was the kind of morning where the air felt like powdered glass, sharp cold and unforgiving. In Colorado, we don't wait for the weather to clear. We learn to work within its fury. The call came through the Joint Rescue Coordination Center (JRCC) with the frantic energy of a high-stakes disaster. A Gulfstream G280, a sleek bird built for billionaires, had vanished from the radar during a transcontinental hop. 1 minute it was cruising at 30,000 feet, navigating the treacherous crosswinds of the Continental Divide. The next, it was a ghost. The silence was broken only by the mournful rhythmic chirp of an emergency locator transmitter (ELT). The signal was bouncing off the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains, originating from an altitude where the air is thin and the survival window is measured in minutes, not hours. I was briefed in the operations center, the blue glow of the monitors reflecting off the flight suits of my crew. My commanding officer, Colonel Nathan Briggs, handed me the manifest, a digital sheet of paper that felt heavier than the lead shielding on a reactor. High-value targets. Major, Briggs said, his voice grim. This isn't just a search and rescue, it's a recovery mission for the elite. The bird went down hard near a ridgeline. Winds are gusting at 50 knots. It's a suicide mission for anyone but your team. I took the tablet, my eyes scanning the passenger list. I expected to see names of lobbyists, perhaps a minor diplomat or a tech CEO, but the first name on the list stopped my heart mid-beat. Harold Whitaker. For a second the room faded away. The 16 years of distance, the rank on my shoulders, and the medals on my chest evaporated. I wasn't Major Whitaker, the veteran pilot. I was the 18-year-old girl standing in the rain watching a man sign a paper that said, I didn't exist. My father, the man who claimed the military would destroy my future, was now a broken man, trapped in a broken machine, waiting for the very military he loathed to pull him from the wreckage. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. He had spent his entire life selling parts for machines like the one I now commanded, yet he never believed in the soul of the person behind the stick. He had dismissed the army as a meat grinder, but now the only thing standing between him and a frozen grave was a United States Army Black Hawk. Major, you okay? Briggs asked, noting my momentary lapse. I took a breath, the cold oxygen snapping me back to reality. My training took over the ironclad discipline of a medevac pilot, overriding the scream of a wounded daughter. In the cockpit, there is no room for ghosts. There is only the mission, the fuel levels, and the lives in the back. I'm fine, Colonel. I replied, my voice as steady as the airframes I flew. Requesting immediate launch. The deployment order was issued within minutes. I walked out to the tarmac, the snow swirling in the rotor wash of the idling helicopters. I climbed into the commander's seat of the lead Black Hawk, the familiar smell of jet fuel and electronics grounding me. My co-pilot began the pre-flight checks, but my mind was already on that ridge. As I pulled the collective and felt the 5 tons of steel lift into the gray morning sky, I realized this wasn't just another rescue. It was a confrontation with the man who had tried to erase me. I was the aircraft commander of the primary rescue bird heading into a storm to save the life of the person who had left me for dead. The flight into the heart of the Rockies was a descent into a white hell. For 2 hours, I battled the cyclic, fighting the violent mountain updrafts that threatened to swat my Blackhawk out of the sky like a fly. The snow was a blinding curtain, reducing our visibility to almost zero, but the ELT signal grew louder, a digital heartbeat thumping in my headset. Finally, we saw it, a jagged scar of black carbon and twisted aluminum against the pristine white of a remote ridge. The Gulfstream G280 had been torn apart. The wings were sheared off and the fuselage lay broken like a discarded toy. I brought the bird down in a daring low hover, the rotor wash creating a private blizzard as my medic and I fast-roped into the knee-deep snow. The silence of the mountains was eerie after the roar of the engines. We moved toward the wreckage, the smell of burnt jet fuel stinging my nostrils. Among the debris huddled under a piece of thermal insulation near the tail section was a single figure. It was him. Harold Whitaker looked smaller than I remembered. The titan of industry was covered in soot, his expensive wool coat torn, his face pale and shivering from the early stages of hypothermia. As I approached, my flight helmet's visor up, he squinted against the glare of the snow. I stood over him, the silhouette of a major in the United States Army, silhouetted by the very machine he had mocked nearly 2 decades ago. His eyes drifted from my face to the Velcro patch on my chest. It read, Whitaker. He went dead silent. The shock seemed to paralyze him more than the cold ever could. His mouth opened, but for a long moment no sound came out. The air between us was heavy with 16 years of unspoken history of rain-slicked driveways and signed affidavits. "Sierra," he croaked. His voice was thin, raspy, and stripped of its usual boardroom authority. It was the first time I had heard my name from his lips since I was 18 years old. I didn't move. I didn't offer a warm embrace. I stood there with the clinical gaze of a mission commander checking him for visible injuries. I waited for the moment of realization, for the apology that had been simmering in my mind for a decade and a half. I waited for him to acknowledge the irony that the meat grinder had produced the only person capable of finding him in this wasteland. But the apology never came. Harold Whitaker blinked, his survival instinct quickly overriding any sense of shame or sentimentality. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the night he threw me out. Instead, he reached out a trembling, gloved hand and gripped my flight suit. His eyes narrowing with that same demanding intensity I remembered from my childhood. "You have to get me out of here," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. There are things in that wreckage. Important things. You have to get me to a secure facility immediately. In that moment, the last lingering hope of a daughter died. I realized that 16 years of war and distance had changed me into a leader, but 16 years of power had only hardened him into a statue. He didn't see a daughter who had come to his rescue. He saw a tool that wore his name. He was still the man who valued assets over people. He was still the man who believed the world owed him a debt of service simply because he was a Whitaker. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a strange, cold clarity. He was just another patient, another mission, nothing more. "The medic will prep you for transport," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "My job is to fly the helicopter, Mr. Whitaker. Nothing else." If you were standing there face to face with the father who disowned you, who left you with nothing but a suitcase in the rain, and now his life is a gift you hold in your hands, would you save him or walk away? While my medic, Sergeant Miller, worked to stabilize my father and prepare him for the litter hoist, I turned my attention back to the shattered remains of the Gulfstream's cabin. Standard operating procedure required me to secure any sensitive items before abandoning the crash site to the elements. The wind howled through the twisted metal, a haunting sound that felt like a warning. Near the rear of the fuselage, half buried under a ceiling panel, I found a heavy reinforced leather briefcase. It was singed but intact, locked with a sophisticated biometric scanner that had been shorted out by the impact. I pried it open with my survival knife, expecting to find personal belongings or perhaps some high-end scotch. Instead, I found the image my father had died trying to protect. The briefcase was stuffed with classified Department of Defense documents, technical specifications for a new line of tactical communication arrays. My eyes darted across the headers. This was part of the Aegis 7 federal contract, a massive $200 million USD deal that Whitaker Defense Logistics had recently been awarded. But as I flipped through the internal memos clipped to the back of the contracts, my blood ran colder than the mountain air. There were handwritten notes in the margins and spreadsheets that didn't add up. The memos spoke of substandard alloy substitutions and accelerated testing protocols that bypassed federal safety standards. My father hadn't just been flying to a board meeting, he was transporting the physical evidence of a massive fraud. I sat back on my heels, the snow crunching beneath my boots. I realized then why he had been so desperate for me to get him out of here, and why he was so obsessed with the wreckage. This wasn't just a business trip. It was a getaway. The documents detailed how Whitaker Defense Logistics had been systematically overcharging the government for defective equipment. They were cutting corners on gear meant to protect soldiers on the front lines, soldiers like me. The very armor and comms that I had relied on in Afghanistan might have been the cheap, fraudulent junk my father was peddling to line his pockets. A sickening realization washed over me. The company was currently under a quiet federal investigation for contract irregularities. If these documents reached the Department of Justice, they wouldn't just be bad for the image. They would be the final nail in the coffin of the Whitaker empire. My father wasn't just facing a PR nightmare, he was looking at multiple counts of federal fraud and potentially decades in a federal penitentiary. I looked back at the man on the stretcher. He was watching me. Even through his pain and the haze of shock, his eyes were locked on that briefcase. He knew what I had found. He knew that the daughter he had discarded as a liability was now the only person holding the keys to his prison cell. In the Army, we are taught that integrity is doing what is right when no one is looking. But right now, the only person looking was the man who had betrayed me first. I had a choice. I could lose the briefcase in the snow protecting the family name one last time, or I could do my duty as an officer of the United States Army. I snapped the briefcase shut and secured it to my flight vest. "Major, we're ready for extraction," Miller shouted over the wind. "Load him up," I commanded, my voice like iron. I didn't look at my father again. The mission had just become much more complicated than a simple rescue. I wasn't just carrying a survivor back to civilization, I was carrying the evidence that would destroy his world. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of monitors replaced the howling mountain wind as we touched down at the military hospital in Colorado Springs. My father was rushed into surgery, but I didn't have time to process the reunion. Before I could even peel off my flight suit, I was intercepted in a private briefing room by two men in dark suits. Federal investigators from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I expected them to grill me about the crash. Instead, they dropped a bombshell that made the ground beneath my combat boots feel like shifting sand. "Major Whitaker, we've been tracking your father's Gulfstream for months," one agent said, leaning against the cold metal table. "But we weren't working alone. We had an internal source. Someone who provided the initial breadcrumbs of the contract fraud." "Who?" I asked, though a sinking feeling was already taking root in my chest. "Your brother, Lucas Whitaker." I froze. The image of Lucas sitting silently at that dinner table 16 years ago flashed in my mind. I had always thought he was a coward for not standing up to our father, but the reality was far more calculated. Lucas hadn't just watched me get disowned. He had spent the last decade playing the role of the loyal CFO while meticulously building a dossier of evidence against the man who built him. The agents explained the play Lucas had tipped off the feds about the Aegis 7 irregularities, knowing that a federal indictment would force our father out of the chairman's seat. By playing the whistleblower, Lucas could claim the moral high ground, save himself from prosecution, and seize total control of Whitaker Defense Logistics. It wasn't a pursuit of justice. It was a corporate coup d'etat disguised as a civic duty. He had waited for our father to be at his weakest to pull the trigger. But there's a problem. The agent continued, his eyes narrowing. Lucas provided the spreadsheets, but we lacked the smoking gun, the original physical contracts with the handwritten overrides. We believe they were on that plane. Without them, your brother's testimony is just one man's word against another's. Your father could walk, and Lucas could be sued for defamation and lose everything. That's when the third twist hit me with the force of a rotor blade. I was the only person who had been at the crash site before the recovery teams arrived. I was the one who had secured the leather briefcase. I was the witness who saw exactly where those documents were hidden and how they were being transported. Lucas didn't know I had the briefcase. My father didn't know I had seen the margins of the contracts. I stood at the center of a three-way war. If I handed over the documents and testified to their location, I would fulfill the Army's code of integrity, but I would also be the final tool in Lucas's cold-blooded betrayal. If I lost the evidence, I would protect the father who threw me away, but I would be betraying every soldier who ever relied on Whitaker equipment. My testimony wouldn't just be about a crash. It would decide which Whitaker man would be destroyed and which would be vindicated. For 16 years, I was the one they ignored. Now I was the only one who mattered. The El Paso County Federal Courthouse was a cathedral of cold stone and flashbulbs. As I walked through the doors in my Class A uniform, my silver wings and Major's oak leaves catching the light, the media frenzy was deafening. This was the trial of the decade, a defense empire collapsing under the weight of its own shadows. I was called to the stand as the primary recovery witness. The courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. To my left sat Lucas wearing a mask of practiced concern, waiting for me to deliver the killing blow to our father's legacy. To my right sat Harold Whitaker. He looked frail, his hand still bandaged from the crash. For the first time in 16 years, he wasn't looking through me. He was looking at me. There was no arrogance in his eyes anymore, only a raw, naked realization of who I had become. I took the oath. My voice didn't waver. I didn't speak as a daughter seeking revenge, nor as a sister seeking loyalty. I spoke as an officer of the United States Army. I detailed the recovery of the leather briefcase, but as the evidence was unraveled, a deeper truth emerged. The technical logs I had salvaged didn't just implicate my father, they exposed a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led directly to Lucas's workstation. My testimony, combined with the forensic recovery of the flight recorder, revealed the final ugly truth. While our father had been negligent and obsessed with image, it was Lucas who had actively manipulated the records to ensure the fraud was traceable only to Harold. Lucas had set the fire, intending to walk away as the hero of the ashes. The courtroom erupted. The perfect heir was exposed as the true architect of the company's downfall. The verdict was a surgical strike. The federal government seized Whitaker Defense Logistics. The empire was dismantled, sold off in pieces to pay back the taxpayers. My father lost every cent, every boardroom title, and every shred of the prestige he had spent a lifetime building. But because my testimony highlighted the manipulation by Lucas, the most severe criminal charges against Harold were mitigated. He lost his empire, but he walked out of that courthouse a free man, while Lucas was led away in handcuffs to face the full weight of federal prosecution. As the crowd cleared in the hallway, I found my father sitting on a wooden bench, looking like a man who had finally seen the sun after a lifetime in a cave. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling. He walked toward me, the silence between us no longer filled with the rain of 16 years ago. "Sierra," he whispered, his voice thick with a humility I didn't know he possessed. "I spent my life building a castle of sand and told you that you were the one who would be destroyed. I was wrong. I was wrong about the Army. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about you." For 16 years I had dreamt of those words. I had imagined they would be the key to my happiness, the final piece of the puzzle that would make me whole. But as I stood there, a decorated major who had saved lives in the most unforgiving corners of the earth, I felt something I didn't expect. I felt nothing. The validation I had once starved for no longer had any value. I didn't need his recognition to know I was a leader. I didn't need his apology to know I was worthy. The army hadn't destroyed me. It had forged me into a woman who didn't need a Whitaker crown to rule her own life. "I'm glad you're safe, Harold," I said calmly, using his name for the first time. I gave him a crisp, professional nod, the kind I'd give any civilian I'd rescued, and turned toward the exit. I walked out into the Colorado sunshine, my boots clicking firmly on the pavement. I had saved the man who disowned me, and in doing so, I had finally set myself free.